Do we have any individuals from Somalia in the group? Please raise your hand. That's for Minnesota, you know. That's called the Great Big Minnesota Scam with one of the dumbest governors ever in history.
If you guys enjoy this video, please leave a like. It's important to me and I appreciate it. Well, Donald Trump is not happy about this Minnesota fraud scandal, and he went off attacking Tim Walz and Ilhan Omar and got a pretty good reaction from his crowd.
I love this Ilhan Omar, whatever the hell her name is, with the little turban. We ought to get her the hell out. She married her brother in order to get in,
That's
right?
what they say.
She married her brother. Can you imagine if Donald Trump married his sister? Beautiful. She's a beautiful person. If I married my sister to get my citizenship, do you think I'd last for about 2 hours, or would it be something less than that?
Yeah, probably not very long. Tim Walz, he's claiming that he's been on top of this investigation and convictions on this fraud since the very beginning, but he was very quick to change the topic when they started asking him questions about it.
You said that you take responsibility for putting people in jail, but all the fraud so far has been federal prosecutions. Why did you say,
they prosecute?
Erroneously say that you...
I didn't erroneously say that. We're the ones that our agencies are bringing it up. We're referring them over. This is how this works. We were through it through the BCA. This is Drew Evans and the superintendent of BCA. These are Minnesota folks who work in state government, who are the ones that are helping build the case, turn it over to the federal authorities. So that is totally false. That is totally wrong. It is Minnesotans. It is Minnesota's investigators. It is the IGs that are over there, Investigator Clark, that are doing the things of putting people in jail. What I can tell you is I am deeply concerned now that they are being federally prosecuted, because just yesterday, the president commuted and pardoned a sentence of a fraudster who took billions and billions of dollars, who served 12 days and was sentenced by an American jury to 45 years. So I am concerned that he releases the fraudsters because they're on federal. If they don't want to prosecute it, we will certainly take them. But this is normal how this works. So my statement is, we are prosecuting and helping put people in jail who are committing fraud in Minnesota, and nothing will change on that.
So according to Governor Walz, he made no mistakes, he bears no responsibility, and you should be talking about Donald Trump, not him. So, you know, that's just typical talk from Tim Walz. Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary under the Trump administration, he had a little bit of different information to provide regarding the investigations, and that it was actually the IRS who started these investigations.
Before I let you go, I want to ask you about this massive fraud out in Minnesota in the state welfare program. It has been under federal investigation since all the way back in 2022. The president told you, though, this week to look into Somalis who, quote, ripped off that state for billions of dollars. He said they contribute nothing. What exactly are you investigating?
Well, Margaret, to be clear, the initial fraud that was discovered by the IRS, for which I'm the acting commissioner, is discovered by IRS Criminal Investigations Unit. This was not an endogenous thing that the state of Minnesota decided we had to go in and clean up the mess for them, and this is part of the continued cleanup. A lot of money has been transferred from the individuals who committed this fraud, including those who donated to the governor, donated to Representative Omar, and donated to A.G. Ellison. These are money the Bureau services, and they are wire transfer organizations that are outside the regulated banking system. And that money has gone overseas, and we are tracking that both to the Middle East and to Somalia to see what the uses of that have been.
Okay, but you have no evidence of that money being used to fuel terrorism at this point, which is what some conservative writers are alleging.
That's why it's an investigation. We started it last week. We'll see where it goes. But I can tell you that, it's terrible. But, when you come to this country, you got to learn which side of the road to drive on. You got to learn to stop at stop signs, and you got to learn not to defraud the American people.
Plenty of criminal behavior from communities well beyond the immigrant community. But we'll talk about this with Representative Omar shortly. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Good. Couldn't let that comment stand. She had to point out that there's plenty of American citizens who commit crimes, not only in the immigrant community, which everybody knows to be true, but we don't need to be importing criminals. Yeah, do not defraud the American people if you're coming as an immigrant. Very important to remember. But this fraud scandal in Minnesota now is going, from what they're talking about, into the billions of dollars. So a huge, huge amount of money. And it makes you wonder who all is involved, who all benefited. And it's hard to imagine that this was all just done within the immigrant community without any help or involvement from state officials or people within the government there in Minnesota, or federal people who were from the state of Minnesota, such as Ilhan Omar. It'd be very interesting to find out if she was involved in this somehow. So I think there's a lot of information that's going to come out later, and we'll learn a lot of things about maybe other people being involved.
And we're joined now by Minnesota Democratic Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Margaret.
We have a lot to get to with you, but I want to pick up on where the Treasury Secretary just left off. He alleged that people who were tied to you or your campaign were involved in this broad, brazen scheme to rip off the Minnesota state welfare system. Do you want to respond to that? Do you know what he is referring to?
I really don't, and I don't think the Secretary himself understands what he's referring to.
So she's never heard this before. This is news to her, and he probably doesn't even know what he's talking to. Well, maybe he does know what he's talking about.
Developing this morning, the Department of Homeland Security linking multiple Democratic lawmakers in Minnesota to an illegal Somali national arrested as part of the immigration crackdown there. Abdul Dahir Ibrahim entered the U.S. in 1995 after being deported from Canada, where he was charged with welfare and asylum fraud. He had been living in Minnesota despite an order by an immigration judge for his removal back in 2004 because of his extensive history of fraud charges. He was finally arrested by ICE agents last week. DHS did post these pictures online of Ibrahim with multiple Democrats they say have allowed him to keep living in the U.S. under sanctuary policies, including failed Minneapolis mayoral candidate Omar Fattah, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, and Governor Tim Walz.
Okay, so here you have a guy in Tim Walz's state who was deported from Canada for welfare and asylum fraud. How did he get into the United States, first of all, and why are they allowing him to stay in the state of Minnesota? It makes absolutely no sense. But strangely enough, he has ties to a lot of these Democrat politicians.
We obviously had people who were able to donate to our campaign that were involved. We sent that money back a couple years ago.
So this was, just for our
All of
audience,
it?
$1 billion in taxpayer money that was stolen. It was pretty shocking. Of the 87 people charged, all but 8 are of Somali descent. And that has added to the spotlight being put specifically on your community. Why do you think this fraud was allowed to get so widespread?
Well, I want to say, this also has an impact on Somalis because we are also taxpayers in Minnesota. We also could have benefited from the program and the money that was stolen.
So do you think, though, that there was a failure by the Democratic state government to
answer the
police
question.
itself? This is a brazen, fraudulent activity here.
Yeah, and that is what I alluded to in my letter that I'd sent to the Secretary of Ag, was to see where things were going wrong. How can this amount of money disappear fraudulently without there being alarms being set off? And it is something that, we have to continue to investigate. We have to continue to ask those questions.
It seems like she doesn't offer really any facts about this investigation or this fraud case. She doesn't seem to know much about it, and she doesn't seem to really be outraged at all over any of this. But if it's not the governor's fault and it's not her fault, who else could it be?
If there was a linkage in that the money that they had stolen going to terrorism, then that is a failure of the FBI and our court system in not figuring that out and basically charging them with these charges.
So again, rather than taking responsibility, just like Tim Walz, she shifts the blame over to the FBI. I'm sure the FBI will get to the bottom of it eventually. But the federal government's taking it pretty seriously, and they're threatening to cut off funding for Medicare and Medicaid to Minnesota.
The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services is threatening to cut off funding to Minnesota over concerns of fraud in the state.
It's true. A Somali fraud ring in Minnesota stole over $1 billion from Medicaid. Our message to Walz is clear. Either fix this in 60 days or start looking under your couch for spare change, because we are done footing the bill for your incompetence.
So a lot of people are going to look at that as cruelty by the federal government for threatening to cut off Medicare, Medicaid to the state of Minnesota. But think about the billions of dollars, potential billions of dollars that were stolen from the federal government that were supposed to go to these services by the state of Minnesota, people within the state of Minnesota, and an incompetent governor who didn't stop it. That's what they're trying to stop, is this kind of fraud and abuse of the system to make the system better and work better for everyone. So to let that kind of fraud continue is not helping anybody.
I want to ask you about something else that the architect of the president's immigration policy, Stephen Miller, said. On Thanksgiving Day, he posted, "No magic transformation occurs when failed states cross borders. At scale, migrants and their descendants recreate the conditions and terrors of their broken homelands." What do you make of this argument of failure to assimilate and sort of ruining America? How do you understand this?
I mean, when I think about Stephen Miller and his white supremacist rhetoric, it reminds me of the way the Nazis described Jewish people in Germany.
So I don't know if that was a question or to just set her up to make some kind of a hateful speech there, but no pushback from Margaret, the host there, calling Stephen Miller a white supremacist, comparing him to Nazis, which is what they do all the time. You know, they always talk about hateful rhetoric coming from Donald Trump and Stephen Miller and people like that, but there's not much worse than calling somebody a Nazi, and there's no legitimate reason to do that. All he's saying is, when you have a country like this that really is a failed state, there's no way to vet people. There's no way to know what someone's background is. And these people live, a lot of them, in violent, corrupt societies. And bringing those people into the United States in mass numbers without being able to properly vet them is a dangerous thing for America and for American citizens. And I think that's what he's trying to say. But of course, pointing that out is hateful Nazi rhetoric somehow.
A massive fraud scandal unfolding in Minnesota, turning into a wake-up call on America's broken welfare system.
One startling example sticking out concerns a program to help recovering addicts find stable housing. Initial estimates for the housing program was for just under $3 million annually. But an indictment shows grifters fraudulently billed Medicaid more than $100 million last year alone.
So right there shows you a program that was expected to cost around $3 million. People wound up billing Medicaid over $100 million.
Governor Walz is also under investigation by the House Oversight Committee. Last week, Chair James Comer gave him a December 17th deadline to provide documents and records related to the investigation.
By the time these investigations are through, they believe the actual size of this fraud, the amount of taxpayer dollars that has been stolen, could be higher than $8 billion.
It looks like the walls are closing in on Governor Walz. But he's under a lot of pressure. He's going to be investigated now, and I think there's going to be a lot of very interesting information about him to come out in the very near future.
Plenty of accusations that Governor Tim Walz turned a blind eye to this. And the Wall Street Journal sums it all up this way, quote, "Democrats won't acknowledge fraud because they want more Americans on the dole. Welfare is central to their political business model. Republicans who make this scandal about immigration are missing the point and missing an opportunity to educate Americans about the entitlement state grift."
That's a great point. Really, a lot of what's going on here is the more people that these Democrat politicians in these states can get on government assistance, the bigger they can grow these programs, the more room there is for fraud and abuse. And it may be that money from these programs is going into their political funds, their campaign funds, or maybe going into their personal bank accounts. We don't know.
Well, I would say, first of all, that I agree that the problem is that the welfare state has gotten far too big with almost virtually very few real eligibility checks or anti-fraud provisions. But I do think that there is clearly an immigration component to this as well. You know, the famous economist Milton Friedman famously remarked that you can't have both open borders and a welfare state. And for decades, the Democrats have been trying to have both. They've invited as many people as they possibly could from all over the globe into our communities, including tens of thousands of Somalians into Minnesota, and then opened up the welfare state to provide benefits with almost no anti-fraud provisions whatsoever. And this is the obvious result. We knew this would happen, and yet Democrats are pushing this for political gain.
Yeah, I think a lot of Americans can't understand why the Democrats want to bring so many people into the United States on such huge numbers, many of them unchecked, and why these Democrat cities and states like Minnesota fight the federal government so hard to keep these people, even the ones that don't belong. And then you see cases like the fraud in Minnesota where over $1 billion now is being suspected, as high as possibly $8 billion disappeared. So starting to maybe shed a little bit of light on some of these questions people have had. And I think the more this information comes out, maybe more of this open borders and all this protecting illegal immigrants, maybe will start to make a little bit more sense to people once we learn more about what's going on there in Minnesota. So what do you guys think? Let me know down in the comments, and I'll see you on the next video.